So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our next Profiles in Innovation speaker, Professor Michele Phelps, who is now an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. She has published path-breaking research on the lag between policy change rhetoric and policy change realities, as well as work on the rise of mass probation as a tool to surveil people and ultimately, in some jurisdictions, contribute to incarceration. And she has received several grants and awards for her work on mass probation and police reform in Minneapolis. And today her talk is titled "The First Step Act, Consensus and Conflict in the Penal Field Under Trump." And she'll help us to make sense of this current moment of bipartisan reform that we've talked about and some of the contradictions and limitations of this moment. And her talk today will be based on her book titled "Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice," which is co-authored with her colleagues Philip Goodman and Joshua Page. So if you will, help me introduce Professor Michele Phelps.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a little bit of a daunting task to be up here as the fourth speaker talking about the First Step Act, but I hope to be able to tease out a bit on where I think all of us agree and where there's points of disagreement and how that shapes what we ought to do moving forward. So thank you for having me. So I want to start by just situating the First Step Act a bit. So based on his campaign rhetoric, as we all know, when Donald Trump was elected president, many feared that it would be the end of criminal justice reform. Trump quickly confirmed this impression in appointing Jeff Sessions, who one of my colleagues refers to as a crime dinosaur. And I tried to work that into a piece I was writing for the media and was told it was a slur, but I actually quite appreciate it. And it highlights, I think, the way that Sessions and some of the president's rhetoric really highlights an older model of thinking about criminal justice and what the problems and solutions are in criminal justice. And as expected, once in office, Sessions quickly reversed a number of the progressive DOJ reforms introduced under Obama. So for a while, it looked like that narrative that criminal justice reform was dead was true, right? But then there was this really interesting turnaround. By December 2018, Jeff Sessions had been ousted, and the federal government had passed this landmark criminal justice reform bill, the First Step Act. And as we've heard a bit about this morning, it was designed to scale back the severe prison sentences for drug offenses in particular, to strengthen early release and compassionate release mechanisms, and to ameliorate some of the worst conditions behind bars. And as we've heard, the final vote on this bill was pushed forward by support from the White House, Republican and Democratic leaders, and a really unlikely set of bipartisan advocates that I'll come back to. So the following month, however, Trump seemed to reverse course again, appointing William Barr, who we haven't talked about yet, but another famous figure from the tough on crime era, to replace Sessions as the Attorney General. So how do we make sense of these chaotic developments in federal criminal justice policy and what they mean for the national system, and where do we go from here? So I'm going to draw on research, as Matt suggested, from my book, Breaking the Pendulum. I want to recognize my colleagues here. I found the best photos of both of them that I could. They are brilliant. Phil Goodman at the University of Toronto and Joshua Page, my colleague at the University of Minnesota. And the book really was a collaborative effort that brought the three of us together. So based on the book project, I want to spend my time here making two interrelated arguments. The first one is going to be that big shifts in criminal justice policy have often been bipartisan, bringing together rather unlikely allies. Yet these moments of surface-level political consensus mask really deep disagreements about who, how, and how much to punish. And the fights over those disagreements and the fundamental terms of the debate really matter for how policies get implemented. And I'm going to argue that the implementation matters more than the legislation, even though our attention tends to be on the legislation. And the second argument I want to make in my limited time today is to say that the story of criminal justice is really local, not federal or not national, and it's shaped by lots of actors in the local and state governments. And so while the First Step Act might seem anomalous in 2018 and might seem like this really promising beacon, I'm going to argue that it was a good step, it was a good first step, but that its direct impact on the national prison population is likely to be almost impossible to detect. And that what's going to matter ultimately is how local and state level policies and practices shift from DAs and policing and courts to prison policy. So let me start with the main framework of our book. So criminal justice is often described as a pendulum, swinging wildly and decisively back and forth between harsh punishment focused on retribution and more lenient treatment focused on redemption or reformation or rehabilitation. So from this vantage point, we can think about Trump's election as this decisive swing into a new punitive era. As my co-authors and I argue in the book, we think that this view of change is incorrect for a couple of reasons. First, let's think about the mechanical swing of a pendulum. So if you give the pendulum one push, right, it moves then of its own accord. And a lot of description of penal change advances this kind of mechanical view, right? Basically that once we start swinging, it's sort of unstoppable, right? It's based on its own momentum. And those moments that drop the first bell in the pendulum are often described as these big rupture moments in macro level forces. So things like shifts in crime, labor market conditions, and other structural factors. And second, the pendulum metaphor suggests that there's really only two equilibrium points, right, at either side of the pendulum, that you're sort of all in one model or you're all in another model. And so what we did was we thought about this framework in the context of punishment in the United States. And the book traces out the history of our country's system of criminal justice all the way from the birth of the prison in the Jacksonian era up to today's reforms, trying to move back and forth between the national picture and local variation, right, to try and make sense of the complexity over time. And what we find in this historical record is that claims of radical regime change are typically misleading and blind us to the blending of penal orientations, policies, and practices, as well as the struggle between actors within the penal field that limits these sort of wholesale transformation moments that appear when we look at the national discourses. So, for example, punishment in the golden era of rehabilitation, we argue, was tough, punitive, and racist. And so too is punishment today, shaped by a really complicated combination of rehabilitation, retribution, and deterrence aims. So in the book, we argue that a better metaphor for change is the constant low-level grinding of tectonic plates, right, which periodically erupt into these rupture moments, these big earthquakes. But that we have to pay attention to that earlier friction if we want to understand the eruption moments, right? We have to understand what that conflict was building up to those moments, the sort of prehistory of regime change. And we think about that friction in a variety of different ways. I think the most obvious example is political combat, but we also think about mass demonstrations outside of and inside of prisons. We think about academic and policy work to reframe the terms of the debate, right? Who's a criminal? How criminals be punished? What is effective solutions? And that all of this struggle among people in the penal field is what actually shapes those eruption moments, right? So rather than thinking about this decisive switch from one model to another, let's think about the messy complexity on the ground, right? And how punishment is always doing all of these things at once, and what that means for a more nuanced take on reform. So to illustrate this point, I want to talk a little bit about the 1990s and the 1994 crime bill, and then talk about what we can learn from that bill when we think about the First Step Act. So we argue in the book that these eruption moments, right, when macro level conditions change to favor one side or the other, they often bring together unlikely allies. So while we typically associate the law and order movement with Republicans or conservatives, new research shows how liberals actually laid the groundwork for the development of mass incarceration. So it was the Johnson administration that first launched the war on crime and expanded federal funding to law enforcement agencies. By the 1990s, Republicans and Democrats sides had all but converged in attitudes toward law enforcement and punishment, fighting to be seen as the toughest on crime. So it was in this context, my colleague Josh Page calls this the purpling of punishment in the 1990s, that Bill Clinton signs the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. The bill made federal sentencing guidelines more severe, increased life sentences and the death penalty, and built up funding streams to increase local police forces and state prison capacity. So in many respects, the 1994 crime bill is really the precursor to the First Step Act, right? The act that the First Step is trying to take a small step towards reversing. So for that moment, I want to linger for a minute on the 94 crime bill and what we can learn from it. So despite the bark of this bill, and it's often become kind of a rallying point around advocates and reformers as sort of the thing that started mass incarceration, right? Or the sort of big bad in this story alongside private prisons in some retellings. But despite the bark of the bill, the best evidence suggests that it actually played relatively little role in the national buildup of mass incarceration. In part because by the time that you get to that bill, the wave of punitive buildup among local police and among courts and in prisons and jails and probation and parole had already started. And the other side of that coin is that actors in the penal field from the moment of the crime bill's passage fought against its implementation, right? And that friction built to a crescendo by the Obama administration. So during Obama's 2 terms, there was no landmark criminal justice legislation passed for the federal system, although as I'll talk about in a minute, there was attempts to pass what a bill that the First Step Act then came to adopt some of the terms. But even though his presidency didn't include any formal criminal justice legislation, he appointed Eric Holder in 2009 as Attorney General, and there were a series of administrative shifts, many of which are formalized in the First Step Act, that he was able to do administratively in that position. So things like scaling back the drug war through prosecutorial discretion, ending solitary confinement for juvenile federal prisoners, limiting the role of private prisons, and reinstating prisoners' eligibility for Pell Grants for higher education. And finally, the last thing we know about the impact of the 1994 crime bill is that it only applies to the federal system. So you've heard a couple of times today the mention that the federal system is really not where the majority of the action is taking place if we think about mass incarceration, but I wanted to show you that numerically. So what this graph shows, sorry, stay near the microphone. What this graph shows is the orange line is the incarceration rate per 100,000 in the population from 1978 to 2013. Start at 78, we go to 2013. The orange line traces the state total, so that's all states put together, and the green line traces the federal total. And what you can see is it's a really small share of the national incarceration rate. The total incarceration rate is those 2 rates added together. So right now the federal system represents about 13% of all prisoners. So because you can't really see the trends in the federal line very well when it's dwarfed by the scale of the state imprisonment rate, I have also mapped here the imprisonment rate just for the federal system on its own axis, so you can see that rate of change. And that red bit, right here, or right there, that is the 1994 crime bill. So what you can see, right, is that there is this massive expansion predating the bill, and that we continue to climb, of course, after the bill, but that we then see these, people have described this as either steep or relatively modest, depending on how they see the scale of the problem, but this, I'll say notable here, decline in the incarceration rate for the federal system, starting around 2009, that was done without any formal legislative changes. So I think there's 3 key lessons from this graphic. First, there's no big start before and after in the 1994 crime bill, even if we just think about the federal system, which is a relatively small share of imprisonment overall. And second, you can have major policy and practice shifts without having any formal legislation passed. And third, the federal system represents a relatively small share of the whole population. Okay, so what does this say about the First Step Act? Why are we talking about the 1994 crime bill here in 2009? Well, I think first, because there's often this really ahistorical view of criminal justice policies in the media and even in some academic conversations. So when the First Step Act, there was sort of breathless media coverage about the unprecedented bipartisan support for this bill, right? As if the 1994 crime bill had never existed, and as if that wasn't wildly popular. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's bipartisan support for criminal justice policy. What's surprising or notable, or hopeful, I would argue, is that that consensus is increasingly oriented around seeing mass incarceration as a problem rather than a policy solution. And since the 2000s, just as the 1994 crime bill followed instead of preceding a bunch of state level and federal changes in policies and practice, the First Step Act really follows rather than precedes a bunch of state level innovation that continues, of course, to this day. We heard a lot about conservative-led states, especially Texas. Texas is really known for these criminal justice reforms, and rightfully so, because there's a logic of if they can do it in Texas, they can do it anywhere. But we've actually seen much larger declines if we think about incarceration rates in states like New York and New Jersey that have gone almost a 30% reduction in their incarceration rates. So this momentum for criminal justice reform isn't brand new. It isn't new under Trump. In fact, what became the First Step Act was partially constructed from its Obama-era precursor, the 2015 Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. And the reason I bring up that 2015 bill is because I think it's really important to think about who were the opponents of that bill and what does that suggest about the passage of the First Step Act and its limitations. So the sort of death knell for the 2015 legislation was a Dear Colleague letter authored by Tom Cotton and none other than Jeff Sessions, who becomes Attorney General under President Trump. And it was signed with a letter of support when it was released from a number of prominent law enforcement officials, including our current Attorney General Barr. So there's certainly a new conservative push for scaling back the criminal justice system, as we heard about this morning, and that is important and meaningful and has made notable strides. And there are a number, as we also heard about, a number of celebrities who have President Trump's ear on this issue, which are leading to positive momentum in this field and the individual release of really important clemency applications. But this bipartisan consensus, and particularly the emergence of the smart on crime or right on crime movement, isn't as seamless as it sometimes is portrayed. And there's still folks who are fighting really virulently against criminal justice reforms, and in fact nearly killed the First Step Act with a series of poison pill amendments. Compared to, say, the 4 senators who voted against the 1994 crime bill, the First Step Act had 12 nay votes. So just as opposition to the 1994 crime bill blunted its impact, I think it's important that we pass the First Step Act, but I think that opposition matters for how we think about its potential to move forward. And there are 4 weaknesses of the bill that I want to walk through in terms of how implementation will matter and the constraints on that implementation. So the first thing is sentencing. One of the Act's quickest impacts was to scale back mandatory minimums for people facing new federal charges, and it made retroactive the reduction in the crack cocaine sentencing disparity. But as we've heard about today, there's increasing consensus that the people who drive the prison population are prosecutors. And if Attorney General Barr, following Sessions, instructs his prosecutors to file the most severe sanctions in all possible cases, including for drug crime, and reverses, as Sessions had done, the use of discretion guidelines around drug cases, it's possible that we won't even see a dent in sentencing to new cases if those 2 trends are counteracting each other simultaneously, right? So if prosecutors are increasing other charges, even as the First Step Act sentencing charge helps in an estimated couple thousand of upcoming cases every year. The second issue is risk assessments. So the First Step Act built in the requirement that to facilitate the early release of many federal prisoners, that the system would have to develop and apply a risk assessment tool. And it's this risk assessment tool that's actually gotten the most criticism among liberal or left-leaning groups, including probably most prominently the Movement for Black Lives, who are concerned about the impact of risk assessment tools on racial disparities. But regardless of the ultimate, whether the tool makes racial disparities in prisons worse or better, it's likely to be expensive and time-consuming, which is going to slow the gains of the good time credits and early release. The third issue is funding. So a number of the provisions of the First Step Act were about expanding treatment programs inside of federal prisons and tying those early release mechanisms to the completion of those programs, but it's still really unclear if those programs are actually going to get funded, right? So we could be setting up a situation where we either have no programs and people aren't able to complete them, so they aren't able to be released early, or they are low quality programs because we haven't actually invested in funding those. And we heard some encouraging notes about some exceptional programs this morning, and I think that's right. There are some really profound models in the country, but I think on average, what we know is that most reentry programs have a relatively small impact on recidivism rates, particularly when they're coupled with stringent parole release policies that reincarcerate people on technical violations. So I think it's a mistake to think that programming, and particularly rehabilitation, is going to be the answer to the recidivism crisis if we don't address particularly parole policies and people's ability to be released if we're not providing these programs. And then finally, and this point is going to sound familiar, so I will keep it very short, the First Step Act, of course, only applies to the federal system, and so at its best, right, it's only a small dent in mass incarceration. I think our best case scenario for it facilitating wide-scale change is that it provides a model or political cover for states to enact their own legislation. Okay. Right, so the only point of this graph is to say we don't know where this would be the line or the red point in 2018 where we have the enactment of the First Step Act, and it remains to be seen what happens with the federal incarceration rate. Okay, so as the conference organizers ask us, and I'll wrap up on this, what's next? And what do we do with this story? So I think I was perhaps invited here to be the depressing sociologist, which is a role my discipline fills well. But I do think that there are real signs of optimism here that I want to end on. So I'm heartened by the increasingly loud consensus that we punish too many people and too harshly. I'm also energized by the broad and active coalition that came together to push through the First Step Act. It's a really incredible roster of groups. More than 150 groups and associations ranging all kinds of political affiliations and nonpartisan groups. It includes former and current law enforcement leaders and associations, including some support from prosecutors, which again is very important. It includes a number of celebrities, which is now apparently very important. And the part that's most exciting to me is that there's a new cohort of people with former and current justice system involvement who are really leading the charge. So you heard from Mark earlier that half of Americans now have a loved one touched by incarceration. I think the struggle of those families and the groups representing those families are the most important force we have moving forward for change. So all of this suggests that there's a real opportunity here to substantially carve back the scale and harms of the carceral state. But I don't think, as you might have guessed, that it's going to come from federal legislation. I think it's going to come to some degree from state level legislation, but just as the system of mass penal control that we currently built through the actions of police and prosecutors and judges and juries across the country, so too must its rollback happen at the local level, right? With the uncoordinated pieces of local, state, and federal systems all moving to downsize. And I think it means looking past to just fixing the criminal justice system, right? To think about better ways to foster individual and community wellness, including things like healthcare access, quality education, access to a safe environment, and economic development. There have been a couple of moments where we've talked about how the justice system is uniquely broken, and I think there's good evidence for that. But it's not actually an anomaly if we think about state policy that affects poor communities, communities of color, where things like school failure are pretty common, environmental justice failures are actually pretty common. So I think we need to think more robustly about how to support our most marginalized communities. So with that, I'll close just to say that I'm excited to share today and tomorrow with all of you to start this work, and thank you for being here.